Well, hey there, kittens. How you doing? We are back. We are back and ready to go with chapter 5. And if you are coming in this late, you should go back and watch the first 4 chapters. I ain't going to discuss it. We just finished chapter 4. We are continuing on with this Data Feminism marathon, and we're going to try to get done with this book as much as we can by the end of the day. See how it goes. All right, so I've switched up the voice. We went old man voice, old white guy voice last time. We're going to go white lady voice this time and see how it goes. Hopefully it's higher quality. Like I said, there seems to be some bias in the quality of voices that Speechify provides when it comes to masculine versus feminine, traditionally feminine voices and masculine voices. And yeah, let's go on with chapter 5, and fingers crossed we can get through this in under an hour. So let's see what the authors have to say.
Chapter 5, The Numbers Don't Speak for Themselves. In April 2014, 276 young women were kidnapped from their high school in the town of Chibok in northern Nigeria. Boko Haram, a militant terrorist group, claimed responsibility for the attacks. The press coverage, both in Nigeria and around the world, was fast and furious. SaharaReporters.com challenged the government's ability to keep their students safe. CNN covered parents' anguish. The Japan Times connected the kidnappings to the increasing unrest in Nigeria's northern states. And the BBC told the story of a girl who had managed to evade the kidnappers. Several weeks after this initial reporting, the popular blog 538 published their own data-driven story about the event. Titled, Kidnapping of Girls in Nigeria is Part of a Worsening Problem. They reported skyrocketing rates of kidnappings. In 2013 alone, the story asserted that there had been more than 3,608 kidnappings of young women. Charts and maps accompanied the story to visually make the case that abduction was at an all-time high.
Pause. Okay, so here we've got the chart. You can see kidnappings skyrocketing. 538.com.
Shortly thereafter, they had to issue an apologetic retraction because their numbers were just plain wrong. The outlet had used the global database of events, language, and tone as their data source. GELT is a big data project by computational social scientist Kalev Leteru, with previous development by Philip Schrott and Patrick Brandt. It collects news reports about events around the world and parses the news reports for actors, events, and geography, with the aim of providing a comprehensive set of data for researchers, government, and civil society. GDELT particularly tries to focus on conflict, whether conflict is likely between two countries, whether unrest is sparking a civil war, all by analyzing media reports. However, as political scientist Aaron Simpson pointed out to 538, in a widely cited Twitter rant, GDELT's primary data source is media reports, and it's not at a stage where you can use it to make reliable claims about separate cases of kidnapping. The kidnapping of schoolgirls in Nigeria was a single event. There were thousands of global media stories about it. GDELT deduplicated some of those to a single event, but still logged, erroneously, that hundreds of events happened that day. And the 538 report was counting each GDELT pseudo-event as a separate kidnapping incident.
Poor data quality. You basically have what we call duplicate cases. And duplicate cases are bad because obviously they're not right. They also, if you use them, tend to skew the data. Right? So so it's pretty self-evident.
Final admonishments in her long thread to 538 is to never ever use #GDELT for reporting of discrete events, because that's not what it's for. This, combined with other commentary and critique from political scientists, statisticians, and bloggers, was embarrassing for 538, not to mention the reporter, but it also illustrates some larger problems about using data found in the wild. First of all, the hype around big data leads projects like GDELT to wildly overstate the completeness and accuracy of their data and algorithms. On their website and in publications, the project leads have stated that GDELT is an initiative to construct a catalog of human societal scale behavior and beliefs across all countries of the world, connecting every person, organization, location, count, theme, news source, and event across the planet into a single massive network that captures what's happening around the world, what its context is, and who's involved, and how the world is feeling about it every single day. That giant mouthful is no small dick of big data. It is clearly big dick data. The question is whether we should take the big dick data at face value, or if the big dick data is designed to trick us into giving it massive amounts of research funding. Yet even when you get past the marketing hype aimed at funders, the GDELT
Scroll.
technical documentation is not quite forthright when it comes to whether it is counting media reports or events. The database 538 used is called the GDELT Event Database, which makes it sound like it's counting events and not media reports. And the documentation for it states that, if an event has been seen before, it will not be included again. This also makes it sound like it's counting events. And a research paper from 2013 states that it's counting events, but only specific to publications. So, still events, but with an asterisk. Both in documentation and in practice, it is unclear how the system actually works, since there are multiple assertions that events are what is being counted. But from a practical standpoint, when you use the system, the results of counting include many duplicate events. Moreover, there is no guidance in its documentation about what kinds of research questions are appropriate to ask the database and what the limitations are. Two people who, like Simpson, are insiders to the field of natural language processing event detection and or the GDELT community may know to not believe 1. the hype, 2. the title of the database, and 3. the documentation. But how would outsiders or newcomers ever know that? The stakes are high for context and data. GDELT is not that different from many other data repositories out there. There are a growing number of portals, observatories, and websites where one can download all manner of open government, corporate, and scientific data. There are APIs where you can write little programs to query large datasets and download them in a structured way. There are test datasets for network analysis, machine learning, social media, and image recognition. There are fun datasets, curious datasets, proliferating newsletters of numbers and datasets, and so on. This would all appear to be a good thing, in the sense that we, in our contemporary moment, tend to think of unfettered access to information as a kind of inherent good. And, in general, it is kind of amazing that one can just go download pigeon racing statistics, social networks of jazz musicians, the
Pause.
lengths of guinea pig teeth, and truckloads of tweets for various hashtags. While 538 did need a schooling on verifying their data, there's a larger problem at work here that has to do with context. One of the central tenets of feminist thinking, outlined by Donna Haraway, is that all knowledge is situated. What this means is that context matters. What are the social, cultural, historical, and material conditions in which knowledge is produced?
I think this kind of feels like a stretch. Not just linking these things together. I think poor data documentation, what's the word I'm looking for? Opaque descriptions of the data, misleading data. I mean, that seems a different issue of situated data. We'll see where they go with this, but at the moment, I'm a little side-eyeing these links because I don't know that their example, I haven't been convinced yet that this example is a natural fit, which is duplicate data because you're doing counting media, right? You're just like counting the number of articles that show up and treating them as discrete. I don't know if that really talks about being situated.
What are the identities of the humans making the knowledge, rather than seeing knowledge artifacts like datasets as neutral and objective fodder to use for more knowledge making? A feminist perspective advocates for connecting them back to their context to better understand their limitations and ethical obligations.
Again, this is just like the name of the dataset is incorrect and misleading. The contents need to be like more clearly described as like media events or media articles. I'm not convinced that situating here, the example is good. I'm not convinced of that yet.
And, ultimately, to better understand the ways in which power and privilege may be obscuring the truth.
Duplicate cases isn't about obscuring the truth. For me, situated stuff, again, we get back to the idea of intersectionality and who's counting and how they choose to define things. For instance, if you are working with a group that only allows for male and female as a checkbox, right? Knowing because of their perspective and values, that's going to be quite different. A critique, not having they're missing out on a whole bunch of data there, right? That's a little bit different from double counting media articles.
The issue is that much of the data downloaded from web portals and APIs comes without context or metadata. If you are lucky, you might get
I wish they would define some of these terms. There's a lot of times where this stuff is important, and maybe it was a long time ago, but metadata is just information about the data. So it could be who collected it, the dates on which it was collected, the sources from which it was collected, the way that it was stored, how it was coded. Actually, that's more of a documentation thing, but it's data about the data itself, right?
a paragraph about where the data are from, or a data dictionary that describes what each column in a spreadsheet means. But more than likely, you get something like this.
I don't know when this more than likely. I mean, for us, when we do deposits at a reputable data archive, all of that metadata is required before you can download it. So I guess most people don't download data from reputable archives, in which case, maybe you should.
The data shown here, open budget data about government procurement in Sao Paulo, do not look very technically complicated. Rather, the complicated part is figuring out how the business process behind them works. How does the government run open bids? How do they decide who gets awarded a contract? Are all bids published here or just the ones that got the contract? What do
Let's pause.
terms like competition, cooperation agreement, and terms of collaboration mean to the data publisher? Why is there such variation in the publication numbering scheme? Without answers to some of these basic questions, it's hard to even begin a data exploration or analysis process. This is not an uncommon situation. Most data arrives on our computational doorstep context-free and ripe for misinterpretation. And context becomes extra complicated when poor data documentation is accompanied by the kind of marketing hype we see from GDELT or other big dick data projects. Claims such as GDELT made to totality and universal objectivity are exactly what led Haraway to propose situated knowledge as a feminist antidote to these kind of unlocatable and so irresponsible knowledge claims. The goal of feminist objectivity then becomes to connect knowledge back to the bodies of its producers and institutions, with their particular histories, values, limitations, and oversights. In short, to consider context in relation to data.
I think there's two different levels here. One is there's a documentation level, right? There's a transparency issue here. And then there's the context framing. So it wasn't a lack of context that created the confusion with the GDELT data. It was that they just straight up misrepresented what their data set was measuring, the data in the data set was measuring. And all the context in the world wasn't going to fix that problem. But merely providing, let me say, accurate data documentation, having a good metadata structure is also not enough here. You know, if you're talking about particular histories, values, limitations, and oversights, that isn't part of the metadata documentation or the accuracy thing. So I kind of feel like they're, at least to the moment, they're conflating two issues here. And that doesn't really help clarify things for the users.
Ironically, some of the admirable aims and actions of the open data movement have worked against the urgency of providing context. Open data is the idea that anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share data for any purpose. And the open data movement, a loose network of organizations, governments, and individuals has been active since the mid-2000s, when groups like the Open Knowledge Institute were founded, and campaigns like the Guardian's Free Our Data 8 originated to petition governments for free access to public records. The ideals are great. Economic development by building apps and services on open data, faster scientific progress when researchers share knowledge, more transparency for citizens to use public information to hold government accountable. The last ideals, transparency and accountability, were key in the framing of President Obama's well-known Open Government Directive in 2009, which directed agencies to make government data open by default. And many more countries, states and cities have followed suit to host open data portals and write open data into policy. 17 countries and over 50 cities and states have adopted the International Open Data Charter, which outlines a set of 6 principles guiding the publication and accessibility of government data. But in practice, limited public funds for technological infrastructure mean that governments prioritize the opening up part of open data, publishing spreadsheets of things like licenses granted, arrest data, or flood zones, but cannot go further on developing context or making data usable in order to ensure access and use by broad groups of the public.
Remember in the last episode where I was talking about how all the things that they were talking about doing were expensive? And that spending that much time doing that kind of background stuff, like participant involvement and developing really good, like this is it. It's one thing to say have open data, and obviously you want to have good data documentation as well, because you can't really do anything with a data set if you don't understand what things are being measured, how they were defined, right? But a lot of times, who's got the money for that? People want research. They don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time enhancing the data and putting in all these sort of context things with it, because that's expensive. It's yeah, it's a challenge.
Raw data dumps might be good for starting a conversation, notes scholar Tim Davies, but they cannot actually ensure engagement or accountability. And in fact, many published datasets sit idle on their portals, awaiting users to undertake the labor of deciphering their bureaucratic arcana. There is even a neologism coined by Daniel Kaufman, an economist with the Revenue Watch Institute, that has been coined to describe this phenomenon. Zombie data.
It's actually this concept has been around. We call them data cemeteries. It's you've got a whole graveyard of data sets that never get used but are out there. So I mean, I think I've heard that a decade ago. It's not a new concept, and I actually have heard it called data cemeteries instead.
Is data that has been published without any purpose or clear use case in mind. So, open data has a context problem. Or, a better way to say this is that governments and data providers have not invested as much time and resources in providing context to end users as they have in providing data.
Because they don't have the budgets. I mean, it's one thing to meet a mandate that the government sets to say, hey, you might need to make your data open, but then they don't give them any money to open the data, to provide that documentation. So, you kind of get you get the requirement, but you don't get the support. And so governments have to have limited resources, right? We don't have infinite amount of resources. It'd be great. I would love a limitless budget for my qualitative election study of Britain. But end of the day, we focus so much on data collection when the elections happen. All our money, all our time goes into the data collection, and we are drowning in data. And then we don't have the resources for someone to come and just spend hours and hours and hours in cleaning up the transcripts. It's difficult. Like, people don't want to fund data cleaning. They want to fund data collection, or data context provision. So yeah, it's a problem.
But do we need to invest in context? Wired magazine editor Chris Anderson would say no. In 2008, in a now famous Wired article titled The End of Theory, Anderson made the claim that with enough data, the numbers speak for themselves.
Well, that's just silly. If you have two different studies that have similar data but measure them in different ways, and structure the response options in different ways, you can't just put those two things together and mix them up. That's kind of like, taking red wine and white wine and pouring it in the same glass. It's still wine, but it's not the same wine. It's not like putting two of the same, two types, exactly the exact same bottles into a different glass. You're not adding to the one thing. You're creating a completely different thing that doesn't do what either of the original ones added out. So obviously that's a silly position, which I guess they're going to argue against, and fair enough, because it's not a very helpful or realistic. It's very, how should I say it would be a very sort of cream crocodile way of looking at things, like, oh yeah, you don't need all this fluffy context stuff. You don't need all this information, about the context. It's just the data can speak for themselves. No, because data are ultimately, they're artificial constructs based on the social construction of concepts that have been operationalized to measure something, right? So let me just go through this. Let's go back to our philosophy of social science, shall we, people? If we want to go into the world and we want to measure something, let's just take something as easy as biological sex, like what you were, like, you go, oh, that's easy, like sitting in your ivory tower, like, oh, I'll just have male or female. Okay, well, what about intersex people? What about people who have like multiple like 3 chromosomes, who like might have don't fit neatly into your boxes? And you're going to say, I have 100%, I've covered 100% of the population here with these 2 categories. Well, you haven't. There's portions of the population that you've defined out of existence, right? Or you have people who are trans who've had operations, right? You don't have a classification for that when it comes to, like, your physicality. So you've defined them out of existence. So immediately your data have flaws. And so, yeah, how we go from an idea in our head to creating definitions for how we would measure that thing, to creating actual ways of measurement. These are all 3 separate steps. And those steps result in an artificial picture of reality, because you can't go out and measure everything in every single way. So it necessarily shapes the things that end up being studied because of how you define and measure the reality that we perceive. And I don't want to get too much into the social construction of reality and the way that language frames and structures and limits and excludes and defaults certain things, but it's coming. It's coming.
His assertion was that the age of big data will soon permit data scientists to do analysis at the scale of the population. Statistics is based on the idea that you can infer things about a population by taking a random and representative sample. For example, say you want to know which candidate all 300
so basically, it's not an idea. This is actually, like, in statistics. We've tested this many, many times. And it is, you can infer things within a margin of error about a population by taking a representative sample. So there's some important words being left out here. I'm going to call them on this because I taught quants, so I know. There's always a margin of error, and the sample has to be representative of the population from which it was drawn. You can do a little bit by weighting inside your data set. So let's say that you do a random sample, and you end up with 57% of the people identifying as, cis women. And you have a better census data on the actual distribution of cis women in your population, and they're not that much. Let's say that they're 52 or 49.7 or something. You can go ahead and create a weight that reduces them down, and that's a way of kind of coping with it, but that's why we have margins of error. So I think they're a little bit setting up a straw man here, and out of fairness to sampling accuracy and what we're actually trying to do with a sample and the importance of a margin of error, I just feel like I need to make that clear.
And 23 million people in the US will vote for in a presidential election. You can't contact all of them, but you can call 3,000 of them.
From a representative, from a statistically, or from a, representative sample. From a sample that's representative of the population.
And use those results to predict what the rest of the people will do.
Again, you're not saying what people are going to do, because there's a difference between saying what... I have a lot of quibbles with this. What people say that they are doing in that moment will not lock them into what they're going to do in 2 weeks' time. People can change their minds. This is another reason why we have margins of error. People don't always say they're going to do what they're going to do. People say, I'm going to vote for this person, and then just not show up on voting on election day. That's a possibility. And you know what that is in a model? Error. That's error in our models. So, and you're not using it to, you're not predicting what the rest of the people will do, right? You're reporting on what the sample at the time, what people are saying. So I gotta haul them up on this. This is just, there's a bit of straw manning going on here. Straw personing in this.
Of course, there's some statistical modeling and uncertainty calculations that need to take place here.
Talk about the margin of error. Don't say uncertainty calculations. That's a fancy name. No one's going to know. What you want to say is a margin of error that takes into account error in the sample. Uncertainty calculations.
And this is the point where Anderson is saying that the theory happens, bridging data collected from a sample with calculations to infer things about a population. At the point when we have data collected about an entire population, theory is no longer necessary.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of reasons why that's wrong. Just ask Bertrand Russell's Inductivist Turkey, which if you don't know about, go watch my course on social science in my quants course.
We also, he says, don't need models and theories to understand why something is happening, just to be able to see that one thing is correlated with another. Correlation is enough.
Clearly not. I mean, this is really easy, and I don't even know if this is accurate to what he's saying. But you have to understand the concept of spurious correlations. So let's just talk about this, right? We can look at ice cream sales over the course of 12 months and plot them out on a monthly basis, and you'll see that they tend to spike in the summer months and they go down, right? And then you look at the number of, let's say, shootings, and you see that in the summer they go up, and the rest of the year is sort of like a bell. There's a bit of a curve in there, right? We also know that people tend to get angrier and more irritable in hot weather. People also like to buy ice cream in hot weather. Does that mean because ice cream sales go up and murder rates or shootings go up in the summer, that eating ice cream causes shootings? Correlation, there's a reason why we say correlation does not equal causation, right? And this data mining of just looking at random relationships of things that correlate, that's a big waste of time. The fact is that when we go to make explanations about things that happen in the world, we don't just take random stuff and put it together and look for relationships. We come with theory. We come with speculation. We think, oh, if this thing's happened, then this other thing might happen. I'll go see if that's the case. Right? So correlation, while interesting, it is interesting to see what things correlate, but then you have to ask yourself, well, why are they correlating? What's the story behind the correlation? And sometimes it's just that they happen to go up and down at the same time, or one goes up and the other goes down, and it's just coincidence, or it's completely independent factors driving the other two things. The third thing, the fact that they're correlated, it's just happens. It's just a thing. There's no reason.
Anderson's main example is Google search. Google's systems don't need to understand why some pages are more linked to than others, only that it's happening, and they will then use that as an indicator of relevance in search. Now, you can't write an article claiming that the scientific
there might be some things that you can, okay, so maybe in something like looking for pages, and if you're only interested in what pages are being used and you don't care why, or what media cycles are driving them, or what events are driving them, if the entire world is irrelevant, yeah, you can look at that stuff, but that doesn't help you understand the world. And a lot of us want to understand the world, not just traffic patterns, irrespective of world events or personal events, things like that.
Method and all theory are obsolete and not expect some pushback. Anderson wrote the piece to be provocative, and there have been numerous responses and debates, including those that challenge the idea that this argument is a new way of thinking in the first place. For example, Francis Bacon argued for inductive reasoning, in which the scientist gathers data, analyzes it, and only thereafter she forms a hypothesis. What has unfolded since 2008 in feminist thinking is also a more sophisticated understanding of the ways in which data-driven systems like Google search do not just reflect back the racism and sexism embedded throughout society, but also participate in reinforcing it. This is the central argument of Algorithms of Oppression, Safiya Noble's study of the harmful stereotypes about Black and Latina women perpetuated by search algorithms. In direct opposition to Anderson, Noble asserts that it is the corporation's responsibility to understand.
Again, I kind of wish they would have laid out their arguments before just jumping into this stuff, so that, because I don't like the way that they have things unfold rather than giving you a roadmap.
Racism in page linking. Correlation without context is not enough when it means that Google recirculates racism. But there's another reason that the numbers don't speak for themselves when it comes to data about women and marginalized people. Not all standpoints are valued equally by society. In writing about a Black woman's standpoint, sociologist Patricia Hill Collins explains that when a group's standpoint is consistently devalued, it becomes subjugated knowledge. Traditionally, the suppression of Black women's ideas within white male-controlled social institutions led African American women to use music, literature, daily conversations, and everyday behavior as important locations for constructing a Black feminist consciousness. When groups of people are systematically taught that mainstream culture excludes their experience, stigmatizes their experience, or completely neglects their experience, then their knowledge and cultural practices either go underground or are completely silenced.
Honestly, this is why I think there are so many white supremacists who are threatened by the idea of like Black history departments and women's studies departments, because they are putting a spotlight on under-researched, undervalued, understudied, or under-taught aspects of American history that don't center heterosexual, cis, white men. And they don't feel comfortable if they're not the stars. And the idea that other people are having stories about American history that where they're not the white men aren't the stars, that is, to them, is very much a threat to the kind of patriarchal norms that they want to reproduce. So I have a lot of sympathy with this take.
When mainstream institutions try to collect data in the context of subjugated knowledge, the results are uneven because the data setting has major imbalances of power. Nowhere is this more evident than in the case of violence against women and the data that tries to capture the reality of this phenomenon. In April 1986, Jean Clary was sexually assaulted and brutally murdered in her dorm room by an acquaintance at Lehigh University. Clary's parents were devastated. Most Americans saw the Challenger splinter into a billion pieces. "That's what happened to our hearts," Connie Clary told People magazine. The Clarys mounted a campaign to improve data collection about crimes on college campuses, and it was successful. The Jean Clary Act was passed in 1990 and requires all U.S. colleges and universities to make on-campus crime statistics available to the public. This now includes separate and specific numbers on sexual violence such as sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. So we have an ostensible...
Okay. Are you getting people to report? A lot of universities don't want to deal with this. A lot of universities, I mean, it's been a long time since I was at university, and I did not see any encouragement of people to report this, or a reporting mechanism, or how the data would be treated, or how your confidentiality would be protected. So, again, data quality concerns here.
Comprehensive national data set about an important public topic. In 2016, 3 senior students, Patrick Torfey, Michaela Halnan, and Jillian Meehan, in Catherine's data journalism class at Emerson College, decided this was a good starting point for their final project. Could the Clary Act data tell them something important about the rape culture that is currently under scrutiny on college campuses? However, upon downloading and exploring the data for colleges in Massachusetts, the students were puzzled. Williams College, a small, wealthy liberal arts college in rural Massachusetts, seemed to have an epidemic of sexual assault, while Boston University, a large research institution in downtown Boston, seemed to have strikingly few cases for its size and population. Not to mention that several high-profile sexual assault cases at BU had made the news in recent years, so BU did not have a great reputation around Boston. The students were suspicious, and with good reason. Their further investigation revealed that the truth is likely closer to the reverse of the picture that the Clary Act numbers paint. But you cannot know that without understanding the context of the data. Colleges and universities are required to report sexual assault data and other campus crimes annually per the Clary Act. And there are stiff financial penalties for not reporting. But it's important to note that the numbers are self-reported. There are only 16 staff members at the U.S. Department of Education devoted to monitoring the more than 7,000 higher education institutions in the country. so it is unlikely that underreporting by an institution would be discovered, except in very high-profile cases, like the Sandusky case at Penn State. Moreover, there are strong incentives not to file a Clary report with high numbers. First of all, no college wants to tell the government, let alone parents of prospective students, that it has a high rate of sexual assault on campus. High numbers of sexual assault are bad for the bottom line, so universities are actually financially incentivized to not encourage survivors to come forward. And survivors of sexual assault themselves often do not come forward because of social stigma, the trauma of reliving their experience, and the resulting lack of social and psychological support. This is subjugated knowledge.
This is actually good stuff. Like, I gotta tip my cap. I have had a lot of criticisms for a lot of the stuff that was presented in this book, but so far, I mean, there was a bit of fluff, again, not my style, but getting into the body of this chapter, it is not fluff. Like, they have concepts that are linked to case studies that illustrate the points they're trying to make. And while I have some quibbles with how they're presenting things, setting up some, straw person arguments, this is so much better than a lot of the other chapters that we've gone through.
By normalizing male sexual violence, mainstream culture has taught survivors that their experience will not be treated with care, and in fact, they may face more harm, blame, and trauma if they do come forward. The result is silence, and the effect on the data is that vast rows of survivors go unaccounted for. As the students consulted with experts, compared Clary Act data with anonymous campus climate surveys, and interviewed survivors, they found that, paradoxically, many of the colleges with higher reported rates of sexual assault were actually places where more institutional resources were being devoted to support for survivors. They quoted Sylvia Spears, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Emerson College, who stated it like this: institutions that have high numbers, it's not always just that high incidents are happening. It's that you've created a culture where people feel they can report, and will be supported in that process.
I want to randomly tie this back to that video that Kevin and I watched where this guy who's like gives off homeschooled Christian vibes was saying, oh, society is so bad because more men than ever in human history are reporting depression. Like, well, yeah, because we spent a lot of time normalizing it, normalizing mental health as a problem that men shouldn't be afraid of or stigmatized by, and we have better diagnoses. So yeah, the fact is that we have more reported cases because more people feel willing to come forward and get help now because of feminism than in patriarchy, which basically blames the victim and encourages men into a spiral of silence that, can worsen their mental health. So yeah, you're going to get more reporting if you create situations where people feel safe giving those reports.
The places with higher numbers had convinced their administrators not to turn a blind eye, and were actively working on shifting the campus climate so that survivors could come forward without fear of shame, blame, or retribution.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So some visualizations of that.
Do you remember the body issues we described in Chapter 1? One of the key reasons that data science needs feminism is that bodies go uncounted, particularly bodies of women and people of color. This is true in the case of data about maternal health, human migration, police killings, health impacts of pollution, and more.
I also want to say that I understand. I don't want to say no. I'm going to say but also. But also men who are marginalized by patriarchal values. So men who are victims of domestic violence, men who are victims of SA, boys, right? All of this is also undercounted and underreported and suppressed knowledge because it doesn't fit within the paradigms of of patriarchal, oppressive masculinity. I don't want to underemphasize or take away from women or people of color or gay people. I just want to say we need to be more inclusive in who gets marginalized, and that also includes boys and men who are victims of SA and all domestic abuse and those kinds of, and who have mental health issues. So just to say like that world is a little bit bigger than the authors are mentioning.
And this is certainly the case with sexual assault data, where society systematically neglects and devalues the standpoint of survivors. Their experiences become subjugated knowledge, stigmatized and silenced. Thus, the collection environment has social, political, and cultural incentives around reporting that are misaligned and work against collecting reliable, accurate data. Simply stated, there are imbalances of power in the data setting, so we cannot take the numbers in the dataset at face value. Here one needs a sophisticated understanding of the context of the data and the actors in the data collection system in order to be able to work with it ethically and truthfully. Lacking this understanding of context and letting the numbers speak.
Hold on one second, y'all. I got my thing's going off. Oh, I've got a filter. Hold on. All right, I'm back. Coming back. Why is there an empty screen? What is going on? Yeah, Kristi forgot that she ordered a filter for her coffee machine and it was going to be delivered today. She wasn't checking her messages to see when the delivery from the Amazon dude would be coming. And now my coffee machine will continue to work well because Cologne water is hard water. All right, so we are back.
Lacking this understanding of context and letting the numbers speak for themselves would tell a story that is not only patently false, but could also be used to reward colleges
Pause.
that are systematically underreporting and creating hostile environments for survivors. Kathy O'Neill, the author of Weapons of Math Destruction, has a term for this. A pernicious feedback loop helps to reinforce the unfair environment from which it spawned. Deliberately undercounting cases of sexual assault leads to being rewarded for underreporting. And the silence around sexual assault continues. The administration is silent, the campus culture is silent, the data set is silent. One of the key analytical missteps of work that lets the numbers speak for themselves is the assumption that data are a raw input rather than seeing them as artifacts that have emerged fully cooked into the world, birthed out of a complex set of social and political circumstances already existing in the data setting.
Can I just pause this and talk a little bit about my own research? So this actually taps into a presentation I gave in Ghent at the European Conference on Politics and Gender. And it related to a series of questions that have been included in international, well, European and some international social surveys going back to the late 80s. And the questions themselves were created in the time of second wave feminism. And as a consequence, they have a lot of values embedded in them that seem very out of date for us 40 years later, or almost 40 years later. For instance, one of the things that the questions focus on when it comes to understanding people's attitude toward gender roles is, one, it is framed exclusively for heterosexual couples, and it always frames things as women choosing between caring for their children and going out into the workforce. So women are always the problem in this. And another thing is, so it's heteronormative, it problematizes women, and it really only looks at things from in terms of unpaid labor versus paid labor. So very much a public-private sort of perspective, which, as I pointed out in the presentation and in my paper, is great if you're a Marxist feminist, because you can kind of track the attitudes toward people's attitudes toward the assumption women are meant to provide unpaid domestic labor in order to uphold capitalism, and you can track that pretty accurately over time. But there are so many people who are excluded from this, like unmarried couples, single couples, gay couple, or single people, single parents, gay couples, that you can't really call these measures of feminism. They don't measure feminist attitudes as we understand them today. They are very much a housework of sociology of housework. You could call it like an evaluation of acceptance of women's role in paid work, but it's not measures of feminism. So it is valuable to have a series of questions that have been asked in multiple surveys and using identical wording over 40 years. But what you can't say using this data is actually more than what you can say. You have to be very careful in how you interpret what people are responding to. And if you wanted to go look for measures of feminism going back 40 years, this ain't it. This ain't it. You can't measure feminist attitudes with these set of questions because they're very much a product of their time. They don't tell you much. They don't tell you really anything about men, attitude towards men roles in the house and provision of care. Or, should men spend more time? Is it a problem with men work and that makes them bad fathers if they have children who are under the preschool children at home? There's a lot of normative assumptions about who should be doing things, and that's built into the question, and therefore it's built into the answers. That's a problem.
It's important to note that there is an emerging class of data creatives whose very existence is premised on context hopping by combining disparate data. This group includes data scientists, data journalists, data artists and designers, researchers and entrepreneurs. In short, pretty much everyone who works with data right now. Data's new creative class is highly rewarded for producing work that creates new value and insight from mining and combining conceptually unrelated data sets. But data is an output first. After that, it can become an input into a new process, but only with understanding of what the limitations of the collection environment were. Raw data is an oxymoron, is the lovely title and primary assertion of a book edited by literary and information studies scholar Lisa Gittleman that traces the history of data and its connections to today's data culture. Many data-driven projects aiming towards producing new, future insights forget to interrogate how the data got collected and cooked in the first place. 538 got the G-Delt events data and jumped into the analysis without looking backwards into how the data was acquired and processed. Clary counts emerge out of a data setting that has an imbalance of power, subjugated knowledge and misaligned incentives, and so does not measure what it appears to on first glimpse. This kind of data is raw input.
But that's a little bit again, I don't think that this G-Delt data, I don't know if it was, I still am not convinced it was a great case study. It's an interesting case study to make the point that it's not enough just to take a data set at face value, but all the context in the world wasn't going to make that better. It was just bad data set. So
put mentality happens in scholarly research as well. An academic paper about the Baumgartner Reddit corpuses, authored by Devin Gaffney and J. Nathan Matthias, made waves in spring 2018. 3 years prior, software developer Jason Baumgartner published a dataset that he claimed contained every publicly available Reddit comment. Computational social scientists were thrilled. To date, at least 15 peer-reviewed studies have used the dataset for research studies on topics like politics, online behavior, breaking news, and hate speech. But Gaffney and Matthias found a big problem with this big dataset. The supposedly complete corpus is missing at least 36 million comments and 28 million submissions. Depending on what the researchers use the corpus for, the missing data may affect the validity of their results. Some researchers have rerun their experiments and found no changes in their findings when they included the missing data, and others have not given any public statement. Gaffney and Matthias's work represents an emerging feminist methodological approach to
all right, but we didn't say what was the missing data. Okay, but what was this 36 million comments and 28 million? It was just was it systematic? You're not giving me enough data and context, authors. I need more context to understand what was wrong with those missing data and why they were missing.
Gaffney and Matthias's work represents an emerging feminist methodological approach to big data research. Instead of using large data sets as raw inputs to create other meaning, they are interrogating the context, limitations, and validity of the data itself. Which is to say, they are examining the data to understand the cooking process. In a similar vein, computer scientists and historians at Stanford undertook a study called Word Embeddings Quantify 100 Years of Gender and Ethnic Stereotypes. Using machine learning and a data set of 200 million words taken from U.S. books, media, and census data from the 20th century, they sought to analyze gender and ethnic stereotypes over time. Word embeddings are numbers that quantify associations between words. So, for example, if woman appears more frequently near emotional, that bias is quantifiable, and we can see whether that relationship shifts or changes over time. Their results show that words like intelligent, logical, and thoughtful had masculine associations before the 1960s and have increasingly been associated with women since then. But other words, like those associated with physical appearance, did not show such comparative progress. In the paper, the researchers assert that shifts in word embeddings can quantify the effects of social activism. They write, the women's movement in the 1960s and 1970s especially had a systemic and drastic effect in women's portrayals in literature and culture. What makes this project feminist in both topic and method is its use of computation to situate gender and ethnic bias in a social and temporal context. Note that the researchers did not try to assert that the data represent how women and men are. They also did not try to remove the bias so that they could study gender differences. They saw the data as what they are, cultural indicators of the changing face of patriarchy and racism, and interrogated them as such. So, how do we collectively produce more work that situates data, interrogates bias, and sensitively treats subjugated standpoints and knowledges? Unfortunately for Chris Anderson, the answer is that we need more theory, context, and scientific method, not less. Why? Because quite simply the humans are always in the loop. Even when the algorithms are doing the heavy lifting, as we showed in What Gets Counted Counts without theory. Survey designers and data analysts are relying on their intuition and common sense theories of the things they are measuring and modeling, and this leads directly down the path towards cognitive bias. Deep context, subjugated standpoints, and computation are not incompatible. Desmond Patton has a unique background. Trained as a social worker, he now runs SafeLab, a research lab at Columbia that uses artificial intelligence to examine the ways that youth of color navigate violence on and offline. He and a team of social work students use social media, specifically Twitter data, to understand and prevent gang violence in Chicago. But when he started doing this work 5 years ago, he ran into a problem. Even though he is African American, grew up in Chicago, and worked in many of these neighborhoods for years in violence prevention, I didn't know what young people were saying, period. At the same time, Patton and his team are acutely aware of the fact that many groups, such as law enforcement and corporate platforms, are already surveilling youth of color online. He continues, "It became really clear to me that we needed a deeper approach to social media data in particular, so that we could really grasp culture, context, and nuance, for the primary reason of not misinterpreting what's being said. The solution to context, in this case, came through direct contact with and centering the perspectives of the youth whom they sought to understand." Patton and doctoral student William Frey hired formerly gang-involved youth to work on the project as domain experts. These experts coded a subset of the millions of tweets, then a team of social work students was trained to code them. The process was long and not without challenges. Patton and Frey actually created a new deep listening method called contextual analysis of social media, in order to help human coders mitigate their own bias in the coding process and get closer to the intended meaning of a single tweet. Finally, they trained a machine learning algorithm to classify the youth's tweets.
I'm going to quibble here. I think we have an interpretation of the intended meaning. Ultimately, the intended meaning of a single tweet comes down to the person themselves accurately remembering and representing what they had in mind. So I think that it's kind of like death of the author. Once you put something out there, it's opened up to interpretation. But I mean, I appreciate this work. It's just the idea that there's, like one intended meaning. There might be multiple intended meanings, or it might be, anyway, I'm quibbling, but you see what I mean.
Says Patton, "We trained the algorithm to think like young African American man on the south side of Chicago. Here is feminist standpoint theory in action in artificial intelligence. The dominant culture approach would have done something naive or misinformed, like counting violent words in tweets. So a tweet like, 'Ain't kill yo mans and I know ya homie,' would have been classified as aggressive or violent, fulfilling the dominant culture's stereotype of black youth. Taking a situated view, from the standpoint of black youth themselves, Frey and Patton were able to show that many tweets like this one are actually youth, quoting music lyrics of local rap stars. In this case, Chicago rapper Lil Durk.
We do this in qualitative analysis. It's called intertextuality, and it's when you make a reference to a text that is understood in the culture. So, I mean, this is not like it's original stuff, but it may be original in its application in terms of the coding here. But I guess because I'm old, the version that I used when I was teaching about intertextuality and how it is used within speech, I made reference to Obama when he did the whole dirt off your shoulders. And he just did like this, right? And the crowd went crazy, and people who knew, and if you didn't know, you didn't know. That kind of intertextual thing draws on something current within the culture. And if you don't understand that, it's like why we struggle. I think people in modern times struggle a lot with all the references to like Greek stories and allegories in medieval texts, because we just don't like know those stories anymore. That's not us, right? And so it's very hard for us to relate to that. But it's absolutely vital if you want to understand the author's intentions and the meaning. If you're quoting a line, it might not just mean that rapper, but it might mean the whole song or the whole vibe of it, or what that person was trying to communicate in that moment, right? So intertextuality, that's the concept they're dealing with here. And yeah, you absolutely need that for accurate data interpretation.
These tweets are about sharing culture, not communicating threats. Note that in order to train an algorithm to understand the context of subjugated standpoints, significant human infrastructure and ethical navigation is required. Frey and Patton have built long-term, ongoing relationships with individuals and organizations in the community. Indeed, Frey lives and works in the community. Both are trained social workers, with years of experience working in violence prevention. According to Patton, they lead with the social workers' code of ethics, one of whose principles is, social workers recognize the central importance of human relationships. Rather than using computation to replace human relations, SafeLab is using AI to broker new forms of understanding across power differentials. This kind of social innovation often goes underappreciated in technical disciplines. As Patton says, "We had a lot of challenges with publishing papers in data science communities about this work, because it is very clear to me that they're slow to care about context. Not that they don't care, but they don't see the innovation or the social justice impact that the work can have." Note that it's not just in the stages of data acquisition and analysis that context matters. Context also comes into play in the framing and communication of numbers. Let's imagine a scenario. In this case, you are a data journalist, and your editor has assigned you to create a graphic and short story about a recent research study. Disparities in mental health referral and diagnosis in the New York City Jail Mental Health Service. This study looked at the medical records of 45,189 first-time inmates, and found that some groups are likely to receive a treatment response, and others are more likely to receive a punishment response. Older people and white people were more likely to receive a mental health diagnosis. Black and Hispanic inmates were more likely to enter solitary confinement. While the researchers explain some of this variation from differential diagnostic rates outside of jail, they also attribute some of the variation to discrimination within the jail system. Either way, the racial and ethnic disparities are a product of structural racism. Consider the difference between these two graphics. The only variation is the title and framing of the chart.
Mental health in jail, racism in jail.
Which one of these graphics would you choose to use? The first, mental health in jail, represents the most typical way that data is communicated. The title appears to be neutral and free of bias. This is a graphic about rates of mental illness diagnosis of inmates broken down by race and ethnicity. The title does not mention race, ethnicity, racism, or health inequities. The title also does not point to what the data means. And remember, from what gets counted counts what happens in the case of not enough meaning. Our helpful, heuristic-loving brains will start to fill in the gaps. The particular subject matter of this data, combining mental illness and race and incarceration, contains 3 charged issues that are particularly prone to stigma and stereotypes. In chart number 1, your viewers' brains will likely start to draw inferences based on stereotypes that use essentialist ideas about race ethnicity.
Pause.
To explain the variation in the data, as in, oh, this is because white people are X and black people are Y. So, here's where an important context question comes in. Are you representing only the 4 numbers that we see in the chart? Or are you representing the context from which they emerged? Because the research study that produced these numbers presents convincing evidence that we should distrust the diagnosis numbers due to racial and ethnic disparities. So, if you publish a chart of those same numbers without questioning them in the title, you are actually undermining the main claim of the research. The scientists' results showed that white prisoners disproportionately receive treatment measures like mental health services, and people of color disproportionately receive punitive measures like solitary confinement. So, chart number 1 is not only not providing enough meaning, but it is also not giving enough information about the main claim of the research. Enter chart number 2, racism in jail, people of color less likely to get mental health diagnosis. There are a couple of important things this title is doing. First, the title is framing a way to interpret the numbers that is in line.
Was that in there? Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't read the subheadline. My bad. There are subheadlines.
With the context and claims of the research study from which they emerged. The research study was about racial disparities, so the title and content of this chart are about racial disparities. Additionally, and crucially, this chart names the forces of oppression that are at work, racism in prison. Rather than leave the door open for stereotypes and essentialist views of race and ethnicity and mental illness to flood your viewers' minds, this chart names the force at work that produces this inequality. It is racism. But, you may say, I don't want to tell people what to think. I want to let them interpret the numbers for themselves. This is an ostensibly noble sentiment, but it fails to acknowledge the power relationship between the author and the audience. As the data journalist in this scenario, you are in a position of power to be able to communicate something to your readers. Presumably, you have researched the topic and know more about it than your audience. Because of that, your audience is in a position of listening and paying attention. What this means is that you have a responsibility, precisely because of your position of privilege, to communicate both the data and the most accurate interpretation of the data. If you let the numbers speak for themselves, this is emphatically not more ethical and more democratic. Why? Because stereotypes and heuristics love a vacuum. Your audience is highly unlikely to go read all the research you read, do the calculations you did, and interview the people you interviewed. They are reading your story or analysis precisely because they do not have the time for that. So if your work fails to provide meaning and context to numbers, their minds will fill in the gaps with the path of least resistance. And that will probably include stereotypes in the case of stigmatized topics like race, gender, mental illness, incarceration, or a host of other topics. The feminist imperative to consider context and situate numbers in relation to their social and political context is not just a recommendation, but a responsibility of ethical data communication. This counsel, to name forces of oppression when they are clearly present in the numbers, particularly applies to data scientists and designers from the dominant group. White people, including ourselves, have a hard time naming and talking about racism. Men have a hard time naming and talking about sexism and patriarchy. Straight people have a hard time seeing and talking about heteronormativity.
I mean, I don't, but I'm weird.
If you are concerned with truth and justice in data, we suggest that you practice recognizing, naming and talking about these structural forces of oppression because it is in aggregated data that they are most evident. We go into further detail about these forces in the power chapter. Part of considering context is understanding that data collection always involves an investment of some combination of interest, money, and time. Like we said in Bring Back the Bodies, counting is power, and that power is not distributed equally across all social groups. There are many important issues, often related to women and other marginalized groups, about which we have little to no data. As artist Mimi Onuoha points out in relation to her project Missing Datasets, this is primarily because institutional incentives do not exist to collect it. And the groups who are most affected by the problem often do not have the resources of either time or money or expertise to do it on their own. These structural issues can feel overwhelming. But honoring context responsibly in the course of one's work with data is also not that complicated. It merely involves a reconception of the role of the data scientist from a raw data massager to a cooked data investigative biographer. It involves looking backwards at the data setting and reflecting on your own identity in relation to the data, before you look forwards to create new insights produced with the data set. Educators, journalists, and civic data publishers are starting to develop more robust tools and methods for context, and we'll take you on a quick tour of several. The first and most important is simply to take an equity pause at the beginning of the project, and later at key strategic moments. An equity pause is a process step in Equidex design, a justice-focused design framework developed by Christine Ortiz, Caroline Hill, and Michelle Molitor. Their framework asserts that research and design can proceed hand in hand with racial equity, but only with an additional set of checks around power and privilege. As applied to data science, an equity pause would involve questioning your research questions, questioning your categories, and questioning your expectations, particularly as they relate to data about people. As Confucius said, real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. But this is really difficult, especially for people who are members of the dominant social group. And the smaller and less diverse your team is, the more likely you are to fall prey to habits of thinking like the self-serving bias and the egocentric bias. Remember the scenario in What Gets Counted counts in which you were.
Pause.
Designing a data project about cell phone data usage? Planning time for an equity pause in the research and discovery phase of a project might lead you to entirely different design decisions as the survey designer. It would allow you the time and space to research contemporary ideas about gender and mobile technology and incorporate them into your work. For example, you might collect more than simply women and men's cell phone usage. Or you might collect gender on a spectrum as a continuous variable, and an equity pause, especially together with a team, may lead you to make some of your implicit assumptions explicit like, women talk more so let's collect minutes. To which your female colleagues might respond, diplomatically, that's an overgeneralizing essentialist assumption. Finally, an equity pause informed by deeper research may lead to highly innovative methods. For example, demographer Jill Williams suggests that quantitative work informed by feminist theory may need to treat gender as a dependent variable, meaning this work would look at gender as an outcome of other intersecting aspects of identity such as age, race, class, sexuality, and ethnicity. Doing that kind of intersectional analysis might lead you to discover the connection between millennials and expanded social networks that you had previously missed. A related but slightly more technical proposal advocated by researchers at Microsoft is being called datasheets for datasets. Inspired by the datasheets that accompany hardware components, Timnit Gebru and colleagues advocate for data publishers to create a short, 3 to 5 page document that accompanies datasets and outlines how they were created and collected, what data is missing, whether pre-processing was done, how the dataset will be maintained, and legal and ethical considerations such as whether the data collection process complies with privacy laws in the EU. Providing more context is in line with a feminist approach to data, and it also helps move towards some of the unrealized ideals of the open data movement around participation, transparency, and civic empowerment. For example, Giselle Crevero, a professor at the University of Sao Paulo, researches the dissemination and reuse of open government data. Brazil has a transparency law on the books that requires the government to publish data about every expenditure in 24 hours or less. Most of this gets published in impenetrable tables with little metadata or documentation, as shown earlier in the chapter with the example of the procurement table. In the project Cuidando do Meu Bairro, Crevero and her team created a tool to make this spending data more accessible to citizens by adding context to the presentation of the information. Their results showed that people could engage with the data better once they could see expenditures that occurred in their neighborhood and what their funding status was. Not only that, the research team was also able to communicate accessibility struggles around lack of context back to government officials and influence how the data was published in the first place. So tools and methods for providing context are being developed and piloted.
We're getting through this so fast.
And there is still hope for the future of open data. But what remains murky is this: which actors in the data ecosystem are responsible for providing context? Is it the end users? In the case of the Reddit comments, we have seen how even the most highly educated among us failed to verify the basic claims of their data source. And datasheets for datasets are great, but can we expect individual people in small teams to conduct an in-depth background research project while on a deadline and a budget? This places unreasonable expectations and responsibility on newcomers and is likely to lead to further high-profile cases of errors and ethical breaches. So, is it the data publishers? In the case of GDELT, we have seen how data publishers, in their quest for research funding, overstate their capabilities and don't document the limitations of the data. In the case of the Reddit comments, the data was provided by an individual acting in good faith, but who did not verify, and probably did not have the resources to verify, his claim to completeness. In the case of the sexual assault data, the university's self-reporting cases are incentivized to under-report, and government is under-resourced to verify and document all the limitations of the data. And if one of the goals is transparency and accountability, the institutions in power often have strong incentives to not provide context, so the data setting is rife with conflicts of interest. Indeed, Gebru and colleagues foresee challenges to publishers specifying ethical considerations on their datasheets, because they may perceive it as exposing themselves to legal and public relations risks. So, is it data intermediaries? Intermediaries might include librarians, journalists, nonprofits, educators, and other public information professionals. These folks are doing context-building work in some piecemeal but important ways. For example, ProPublica, the nonprofit news organization, has compiled the largest U.S. database on school segregation from public data sources. They provide a 21-page document to give context on where the data comes from, the time period it covers, and what kinds of questions are appropriate to ask of the data. The nonprofit Measuring Justice provides comprehensive and contextualized data on criminal justice and incarceration rates in the U.S. So, intermediaries who clean and contextualize the data for public use have potential, but there would have to be a funding mechanism. Significant capacity building and professional norm setting that would need to take place to do this at scale. Houston, we have a public information problem. Until we invest as much in providing context as we do in publishing data, we will end
This is kind of my point about the resources.
up with public information resources that are subpar at best and dangerous at worst. The bottom line for numbers is that they cannot speak for themselves. In fact, those of us who work with data must actively prevent numbers from speaking for themselves, because when those numbers come from a data setting with a power imbalance or misaligned collection incentives, and especially when the numbers have to do with human beings, then they run the risk of being not only discriminatory, not only empirically wrong, but actually dangerous in their reinforcement of an unjust status quo. Considering context should be a frontier for open data advocates, philanthropic foundations, researchers, news organizations, and perhaps most importantly, regulators.
Yeah, you didn't mention funders here. Funders is important. Also, university. I mean, again, I come from a bias, but university, like ethics committees. This seems like this would be ripe for something to include in an ethical proposal, because we want to do data ethically, right? And that includes the construction of the data, not only informed consent and harm to participants, but also our ethical obligations to produce high quality data. I have much less complaints about that chapter, or far fewer, I should say. I have far fewer complaints, mostly because it was almost 90% substance and only 10% fluff, which I appreciate, because that first chapter about ninjas and unicorns, I was dying. I was like, why am I learning this? Why am I here? What does this got to do with anything? This one was much tighter, much better written, much clearer, with problems and solutions. Problems, case studies, explaining what the problems are, and then solutions at least pointed to, or good practices. And this is probably the best written chapter I think I've seen so far. Right. It is now 1 o'clock. I started at 10. I gave myself a half hour for a break. I'm kind of tapping out here. I don't think I can do another couple hours. So at least we got through 2 more chapters today. And the other one, yeah, it's got a lot of stuff. I don't feel like I could do a good enough job. So we will continue the marathon another weekend, another day, but this was very helpful. And once we've got this done, I can get back to different content, which will be good. But I'm glad we're doing this, and for those of you who are finding this interesting, I'm glad that
Chapter 6.
you are here and paying attention in the future. So I'm gonna go chill out and relax, and also replace the water filter in my coffee machine, so my coffee doesn't get all caulky. And I think that's it. So all that's left to be said is that I've been Kristi. You've been awesome, and I wish you a great day wherever it is